Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman. He's the author of Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian. It's part of the University of Illinois Press Mormon Thought series. So Matt was one of the idea generators on that, so you won't want to miss this conversation. We're going to be talking about Joseph Fielding Smith, often is seen as an apologist rather than an academic historian. Is there such thing as a true objective history? Matt may surprise you. I think he will. You won't want to miss this conversation. We're also going to talk about the original RLDS Polygamy Skeptics and the fights that Joseph Fielding Smith got in with his cousins in the RLDS Church. So you won't want to miss this conversation for sure. Check it out.
And, to his credit, right, now, of course, and he was not a professional archivist, right, and so he will do stuff like that. He also, though, when he becomes historian of the church, he is more or less faced with several large rooms with gigantic boxes stuffed with materials in them, and that's it, right? And so he does actually begin, especially after World War II, to professionalize the archives, which is to say we should organize this material. We should generate finding aids for every collection. We should actually divide all these boxes into collections and make lists of what's in those collections. He begins the process of microfilming a lot of this material, right? So he is professionalizing it in some way, but he also, I think, and that's kind of archival practice, of which, scissoring is not good archival practice. In other ways, he is professionalizing it. In other ways, though, but from the historian's perspective, he is, for good and all, not what a professional historian would consider professional, which is to say, right, he believes that one can treat, for instance, the Bible as reliable history of the ancient world, which most professional academics would say you cannot do that, right? He does not have the kind of suspicion of sources that most professional historians have. And when I say suspicion of sources, what I mean is not that we should look at sources and doubt them, but when we look at a source, we want to interrogate that source. We want to say, who wrote this? When did this person write this document? What are the persons who wrote this document? What are their own biases? It's not to say that sources with biases are bad, because as I tell my students, there is no history and no source that does not have bias. When a student walks in, and especially a Mormon studies student, they might come in and say, I want to do objective history of Mormonism. I will say, that is not a thing. There is no objective history of anything in this world. The question is, what biases does your source have? And writing academic history that lives up to academic standards, is itself actually a bias. It is
really?
It's absolutely a bias, right? But it is the sort of bias, right, that exists to allow scholars to communicate with each other in an intelligible way. But it is no less a bias than a Roman Catholic hagiographer who's writing a biography of Joan of Arc and says, obviously Joan of Arc saw the Archangel Michael, right? That's a bias too. It's a different sort of bias, but the thing that professional historians are trained to do is to think about bias and to think about what biases your sources have, and how do you deal with those biases when you are writing your history. Fielding Smith did not share that. Fielding Smith treats sources produced by his family uncritically because he believes they were revelators. And so therefore there's no need to question what Joseph Smith Jr. says. There's no need to question what Joseph F. Smith says because they are revelators, right? So he approaches those sources uncritically because he believes that they are divinely inspired, right? And that is what separates him from professional academics. It is also, to some degree, what separates professional academics from amateur academics. Scholars who will write, and there's a lot of these, right, in the tradition of the LDS Church, a lot of scholars who are not trained academics, who will write history of the church, but often don't have that same kind of suspicion of sources that you are trained to. They might just go the opposite way, right? There are people who will write about Joseph Smith and just flip that kind of pro Joseph Smith Jr. bias that Fielding Smith had to an anti-Joseph Smith bias, right? Which is the same thing, right? It's also a bias. It's not objective. There, as I say, there is no objectivity in the writing of history. The best you can do is be aware of what biases are. Anyhow, this is a long tangent, but it does, I hope.
No, it's good. I like it.
It helps us explain what Joseph Fielding Smith is doing when he is writing history. His book, Essentials in Church History, right, is an example of this. It is a history of the church that treats official LDS sources, and when I say official, what I mean is sources produced by LDS leaders, entirely uncritically, which means it doesn't live up to academic standards, right? But that volume does become a very, very kind of landmark and monumental work in the history of the LDS Church, and it shapes LDS discourse about what their history is for decades.
Is that Mormon doctrine before Mormon doctrine?
Actually, you know what I think Mormon doctrine before Mormon doctrine is Joseph Smith's column. His column in the Improvement area in the Church magazine called My Question. He has this column for years, and he simply takes questions from readers and he answers them. And these questions they're all over the place, right? There are questions about Adam and Eve, questions about the Hebrew Bible, about the New Testament, questions about playing cards, and Fielding Smith answers them in the very, very kind of authoritative way. And
no playing cards.
No playing cards. And eventually, right, those questions are collated by editors. His son, actually, Joseph Fielding Smith Jr., collates these into a 5-volume series called Answers to Gospel Questions. Just as Bruce R. McConkie, his son-in-law, collates a lot of his other writings into a collection called Doctrines of Salvation. And this is, I think, something interesting about Fielding Smith, and something that maybe differentiates him from McConkie a little bit. Fielding Smith has a very expansive mind, but his mind is very narrative-oriented. He wants to tell stories. He wants to write history, right? And so many of his works are essentially kind of retellings of the story of humanity, the story of the church, and so on. Bruce R. McConkie's mind is encyclopedic. McConkie wants to organize doctrine, right? And this is what he does with gospel doctrine, right? It's basically a dictionary or an encyclopedia. And it's why he takes his father-in-law's writings and breaks them up into doctrines of salvation, which is also arranged by topic, right? He turns Fielding Smith's writings into a reference collection, which they were not prior to that.
That's so interesting. Jumping back to there's no such thing as an objective history. Because one of the funniest things that I will get, I've gotten a lot of new listeners lately, and when I get a new listener, one of the things that they will always ask is, "Are you LDS?" Because I do try to kind of hide that because I want it to be quote unquote objective history or fair history. And so for you to say there's no such thing as objective history, that's his own bias. Is fair history a good way to say that? Or how do academics, I guess, approach that? Because I want to be objective. I want to be fair, and so how do you approach that?
Yeah, I will tell my students, right, the way to think about this is not objective, right? Objective is the wrong word because nobody is objective. That's an impossibility. Rather, I would say the thing that differentiates academic history is abiding by the methods and principles that have been generated over like a century and a half of writing academic history, and emerges ultimately from Germany. And it still is a kind of process of dispute and debate, which is what does it mean to do this? Or there is right now, actually, in the scholarship on religion, a real debate about how to treat charismatic experiences, things like visions, right? And how should we kind of treat that? And being an academic historian and writing academic history is, I think, first being aware of those sorts of conversations. being aware, there are disputes about how to treat certain sources, and here is my position on that. And secondly, it is really being aware of how bias shapes yourself, how bias shapes the sources that you are looking at, and accounting for that bias in your work. So a really good, I think, piece of scholarship. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a useful example here. I mean, polygamy is a good one, right? There's lots of disputes about documents on Joseph Smith's polygamy and how he produced polygamy. And if he wrote any sources about polygamy, what records do we have of it? A really kind of simplistic way to do that would be to say, well, here is a statement from Joseph Smith in which he said he did not practice polygamy. Therefore, he did not practice polygamy. But an academic scholar would say, well, wait, what are the circumstances in which this document is produced? What is motivating his production of that document? And can we weigh his motivations in his production of that document against his motivations in the production of other documents? And doing your best, right, to account for all of that stuff, and also critically being frank in saying, here's what I believe about all of this, and here is why I believe it. And I think that is something, oftentimes when young graduate students begin working in the field, they try to hide their own point of view and to say, right, and to use a sort of like this monumental, in the past, the following things happened, and here is what happened and why. But I think the more comfortable scholars get as scholars, the more comfortable they grow as sort of accounting for their own point of view. And talking about their point of view in their work and saying, here is how my point of view shapes this. And certainly I think you see that in Richard Bushman, in his scholarship on Joseph Smith. He will, if you read Rushstone Rolling or his new book on the gold plates, he will talk in the introduction to that of here's where I'm coming from. And here is what I am aware of my own point of view, and here is how I'm trying to account for that in the work that I have done. That is, I think, really kind of mature scholarship. It's not being objective, it's being aware of bias and being frank about bias and how everything is biased and trying to show your readers how you are trying to account for that.
So am I making a mistake by purposely not giving my opinion and trying to be objective or fair? Is that a mistake?
Oh, I mean, podcasting is a different thing from writing peer-reviewed scholarship.
But I talk to the scholars. It's not peer review. I get it, but I'm trying to be as fair, as neutral as possible. Is that a mistake? Because there's no such thing as objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a mistake to pretend that you are objective.
Okay. So give me some advice here. What should I do? How should I change?
I think you can be frank about your own point of view, right, and be confident in your own point of view, and to think through, here is why I believe the things that I believe, and here are the reasons for that. And one reason people will try to say I am objective, well, there are two reasons. I think one is they might be saying, by implication, other people are not objective, and therefore I'm better than them. And that itself is a mistake, because you're not objective either. Nobody is, right? But another reason for it, I think, is in some ways, and this is not to say anything about you personally, but it is to say insecurity. And that's something I'll see in young scholars, right? They'll kind of try to hide behind the mask of objectivity because they're worried about their work being accepted. And if they can say I'm objective, right, that's a way to kind of distance yourself from it in some ways.
Oh wow, this is interesting, because I'm sitting here saying, so what?
This is definitely not a Rick therapy session.
So yeah, well, you've given me a lot to think about here. I don't know. I kind of like not giving my opinions because you can't hold me to them.
This is something an editor told me. My editor who worked with me on my book about alien abduction. And I'm particularly in that book looking at the case of Betty and Barney Hill. Mm-hmm. Right? And Betty and Barney Hill are a couple who in 1961 claimed that they were abducted by aliens. And they're the first people in American history to say that they were abducted by aliens in the kind of classic mode, of being taken up into a ship and medical experiments and all of that kind of stuff. My editor said to me, you got to say whether or not you think they were abducted. And if you don't think they were abducted, you have to say, what do you think happened? It is very, very common. It is very, very common, right, in scholarship on religion, and by extension, things like alien abduction, for scholars to say, here is what this person said happened, and just to leave it at that. And this is actually how Richard Bushman does it in Northstone Rolling, right? Richard Bushman says, Joseph Smith said that he spoke to God and Jesus Christ. Joseph Smith believed that, and I'm just going to proceed from there. And that's one point of view, right? And Bushman has received some criticism from some other scholars who say, well, I think Joseph Smith was a fraud. He was making this up. And so Bushman defends his point of view. Bushman says, I believe Joseph Smith really actually believed this happened to him, and here's my evidence for that. Other scholars might say, I think Joseph Smith was a fraud, and here's my evidence for that. But, of course, Bushman also says in that book, I believe this, maybe in part because, as he says, I am myself a Latter-day Saint. And what you will often see, I think, is maybe disaffected or ex-Latter-day Saints who will say, I'm objective. But, of course, their own position, the fact that they have left the church, also bears upon their interpretations, as much as Bushman's bears upon him. So bringing this back around, right, when that editor told me, you've got to say what you think. You have to say, do you think they were abducted or not? You cannot simply say, they said they were. So
That's a mean question.
I actually don't think they were abducted. I do think they saw something strange in the sky that night, but I think their abduction memories were generated later by the process of hypnosis. And that's fair enough, right? That does mean I think there are people who do think they were abducted, who are coming after me now. But, if I'm going to own my opinion, I have to stand on it. So
I like the Richard Bushman method there. That's what I'm more comfortable with. And I mean, is it true? Don't you think more scholars are more comfortable saying, well, Joseph Smith said this, I think Joseph Smith believed that, and leave yourself out of it, right? Isn't that what scholars like to do?
Yeah. And the thing is there, though, Bushman acknowledges he's not actually leaving himself out of it, right? He says in the introduction to Roughstone Rolling, it is probable my opinions about this are shaped by the fact that I'm a lifelong member of this church. That's entirely possible. Now, I'm going to make the case for it as best I can, and he does do that, right? He goes through the evidence. He says, here's all the evidence that shapes why I think Joseph Smith really believed in everything that he said, but I cannot discount the possibility that my opinion is shaped by my personal relationship to this church. Just as, Dan Vogel's interpretation of Joseph Smith is also shaped by his relationship to the LDS Church. Mm-hmm. And denying that is simply folly, I think. Denying that your own opinions are going to be shaped by your own background. That's simply inconceivable, I think.
Interesting. Well, I didn't know you were going to go to the polygamy skepticism thing, so I want to dive into that can of worms. Because it's funny to go back to Richard Evans from the Community of Christ. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was a kind of a beloved member. I guess I should say the RLDS Church, because he was never a member of Community of Christ, but he was a member of the RLDS Church. And so these back and forth between Joseph Fielding and Richard Evans, I mean, is Richard Evans the original polygamy skeptic?
Well, not the original, right? Because, of course, there were other people before him. But
the
I think
most influential, maybe?
Nah, I don't even know about that, right? I would probably say today, at least, the Prices are more Pamela and Richard. I'm forgetting his name. The Price couple, right? Yeah, Richard, thank you. Yeah. They are probably more influential than Evans is today. But it is true, I think, that a lot of the energy behind the polygamy denial movement comes out of the Community of Christ, which was, of course, charged by what Joseph Smith's children believed, which was shaped in turn by what Emma Smith told them.
Can you talk a little bit more about how Richard Evans and Richard and Pamela Price use sources? I mean, my guess is they wouldn't use them as an academic would. Do you see any problems, or maybe they use them well? I don't know. How would you characterize their use of sources?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a really big question. But let's take one example, which is the Prices and the Cochranites. Do you know the Cochranites?
I do, but tell my listeners who don't.
So this is a small sect of Restorationist Christians who began to practice polygamy in the early 19th century, right? And there is some contact between Cochranites and members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And the Prices hypothesize that the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the LDS Church are inspired in part by the Cochranites to practice polygamy. Then they were in fact kind of converted to polygamy by their contact with the Cochranites. Now, the Prices do establish, right, that there was contact here, that there is communication between the Cochranites and the Quorum of the 12. However, extrapolating then from that to 20 years later, the Quorum of the 12 is going to publicly announce polygamy in Utah, right? There's a leap there, a chronological leap between when presumably the 12 apostles become polygamists or polygamy believers under the influence of the Cochranites, and when they officially announce that we are doing this thing, right? And the Prices just simply don't account for that gap in time, and don't demonstrate, I think, any really persuasive reason as to why the apostles would have waited so long. And that is not now, and I will say that is not a question the Prices ask. Why is this gap in time a problem? It doesn't occur to them to ask it. And it doesn't occur to them to ask it, I think, because they are primed to believe that the Quorum of the 12 were the originators of polygamy in the first place. And that's what I mean by objectivity is impossible, right? It's not necessarily, when I say objectivity is impossible, it's not to say that you are necessarily motivated to lead your sources to a predetermined conclusion. That's not necessarily what bias is. It is not always that you have a predetermined conclusion in your head. Bias is sometimes, and oftentimes actually, maybe even more often, manifest in the kinds of questions that occur to you to ask. And that is actually something that I think we're learning, especially white academics, from minority academic groups. Women and minority racial groups who ask different questions than white people do and than white men do, because their upbringing and their background leads them to ask different sorts of questions. And that's the most common thing I think academics would say. You learn to kind of understand how you are influenced to ask the kinds of questions that you do of the sources that you do. And you become aware, hopefully, of the process by which you come to the questions that interest you.
Okay, so to summarize, is it... So because they're coming from where they are, the Prices specifically, and I don't know if this applies to Evans as well, it didn't even occur to them to ask certain questions. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I don't know what was going on in their head, right? But I will say the question of why is there such a gap between when the apostles encounter the Cochranites and when the apostles start embracing polygamy in public? Why is there such a gap of years in that time?
Or decades.
They don't ask that question, right? And it appears to me they're not interested in it, or that question may not even have occurred to them to ask, right?
Okay. Is it fair to say that this is due to motivated reasoning, or are we all guilty of motivated reasoning?
Yeah. I mean, motivated reasoning, I think, being like, I have a conclusion already and I'm going to steer my sources to that conclusion. There are people who do that, but I think that is not as common as accusations might imply. All right, I think mostly the question of bias is the question of which questions are you interested in? What questions interest you, and what things does it not occur to you to ask? And that, I think, often comes from your own background and your own positionality.
Okay.
More Joseph Fielding Smith?
Yeah, we need to go back there, but we'll do that in just a second. You got a little bit of flack for, I believe it was a letter to the editorial or something, for calling the polygamy skeptic movement, just recycled RLDS arguments. Do you stand by that, or do you think that they're doing some good work there?
I am not going to talk about them.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, we'll jump in there. I thought I had to ask the question, though.
I totally get that.
Okay. So let's go back to Joseph Fielding Smith then. What are some of his most important works? And it's funny because you mentioned his son actually came up with one that I thought was written by him, but I guess, it's influenced by him for sure. I think Way to Perfection. I'm trying to remember what the other ones were, but can you talk about some of his influential books?
Oh yeah, there's lots. He wrote a lot. We talked already about Essentials in Church History, right, which is this kind of history of the church. Then there's these other couple. You mentioned The Way to Perfection, which in some ways is kind of a history of humanity and how humanity goes from the pre-existence to the afterlife and so on and so forth. That's a big one because I think his ideas about race are most explicitly expressed in that book. And then, of course, as I said, right, there's these couple that are collated from his writings, Answers to Gospel Questions and Doctrines of Salvation, which are both kind of edited by the next generation, right, his son and his son-in-law. And I think, those are paramount. I really do think the column is maybe as influential as any of his books because that thing is in the improvement era and church members are reading it every month.
And because it used to be, and it's probably because of Joseph Fielding Smith, I remember even in the 1980s, I have a question. I don't think he was answering those questions in the 80s. Well, he wasn't because he was dead. But I believe that, I don't read the Ensign as much as I should anymore, but it's online now. But that column was kind of discontinued, wasn't it? And is that kind of the continuation of Fielding Smith?
Yeah. That one is. A lot of different people are answering those. So that Ensign column, you would have, a question appear from a member of the church, and then they would pull in a professor at BYU or sometimes a general authority to answer it. So, but I think it's carrying on the idea of Fielding Smith's. Now, with his column, of course, he was answering them all personally.
Okay. And so you think of all of his books and everything, you think I don't remember what it was called, but the I Have a Question column was his most influential?
That one, I think, reached the biggest audience, right? Because it is everybody who receives the church magazines is receiving that column and they're reading it. His books, of course, also do pretty well, too. After his death, I think Answers to Gospel Questions and Doctrines of Salvation become really influential because they're convenient and they're a reference style. And so if a member of the church has to give a talk on the atonement, they can pull down that book and open it up to atonement and see a bunch of stuff that Fielding Smith wrote about atonement, right? But in his lifetime, the column reaches a lot of people. And then his biggest book, and I think probably the book that if you asked him, what is your most important book? I think he would say, Man, His Origin and Destiny, which is published in 1954 and is his big refutation of higher criticism of the Bible, his big refutation of the theory of evolution.
Would you say he's, and especially compare this with Bruce R. McConkie, he's the most influential LDS theologian in the 20th century?
Yes. I think McConkie is really a popularizer of Fielding Smith, a systematizer of Fielding Smith, but McConkie is largely derivative of Fielding Smith.
Okay, so they're kind of the big two.
Yeah, and then you have the others, right, the Talmages and such like, but I really think Fielding Smith sort of overshadows that earlier generation.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman. He's the author of Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian. If you haven't signed up, you better sign up quick because we're going to give in this away really soon. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest and you could win this book right here. In our next conversation, which is only available to newsletter subscribers, by the way, Go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter if you'd like to get the final part of our conversation, where we're going to talk about Black's Lowell Benyon and Ezra Taft Benson. So you won't want to miss this conversation, but it's only available to newsletter subscribers. Here's some of the things we're going to talk about.
As you said earlier, right, the way to perfection, which is his account of the human spirit and what happens to the human spirit from the pre-existence to the afterlife. And in that volume, he quite explicitly states that he subscribes to the theory that people born to African descent were less righteous in the pre-existence. And he uses all sorts of pretty egregious language. They were not entitled to be born white, etc., etc., etc. So he is very much, I think, a kind of defender of the racial restrictions in the church. I think one of the most influential exponents of that particular idea.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.